Hello, and welcome to the Copilot for Microsoft 365. Ask Me Anything. I'm Mary David Pasch, and I'm joined here with my fellow colleagues, product experts, to help answer your questions about Copilot. Here on the call is Samar, Jack, Alyson, and Brian, and they truly are experts in this product who can answer your questions. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into our first question. One of the questions we have here is, how do we manage authentication and authorization of AI calls to the LLM to ensure data is safe? And Brian, do you want to go ahead and jump in on this one?
Sure, can give you a little overview of how we're working with this inside of Copilot for Microsoft 365. So from a standpoint of what data do you have access to, we're using Microsoft Graph as our grounding for being able to pull back data that you may have inside of Microsoft 365. And with Microsoft Graph, we are using your personal credentials, basically to say, hey, what emails, chats, files, other kind of information do you have available to you? If you don't have access to it, Copilot will not be able to reason over that data. So from the standpoint of authentication for authorization, Copilot will only know about the information that you as a user have access to be able to return that back to you in terms of the data that you get back.
Great, yeah, and just a great reminder to everybody who's listening in here. We've built Copilot for Microsoft 365 on top of Microsoft 365. So all of the commitments that we make for how we do authentication and authorization all remain the same. So you can feel confident knowing that that how it works today, it continues to be upheld by Microsoft. Great, thanks so much, Brian. Another question here from LinkedIn. Do I need to buy a Copilot Studio license to extend Copilot?
Good question. I'm happy to take this one. Yeah, so for Copilot Studio, we announced an inclusion of that license inside of Copilot for Microsoft 365 back in November. So if you buy Copilot for Microsoft 365 today, that $30 license, you get Copilot Studio to extend with plugins. So as soon as you want to do more than extend plugins and go, hey, I'd love to actually build my own Copilot, that's a separate license. It's $210 per month, and you can take a look at that. But the easy answer is, if you have Copilot for M365, you get Copilot Studio capabilities to build plugins and extend that experience.
Great. All right, question from Katarina from our tech community. Does Copilot get the external data every time it's requested? Can we have some type of cache?
I can go ahead and take that one. So from a external data perspective, there's really kind of two ways that we can integrate with this for extensibility. So the first is going to be Microsoft Graph Connectors, and the second is going to be with plugins. The idea with Graph Connectors is we actually have a pre-indexed version of that data that's being brought in. Basically, think about like a shallow copy. That information, we will reason over that every single time a user goes in to request for information from Copilot. So we'll take a look at data again from Exchange, from SharePoint, from Teams, as well as Graph Connected data. Or if you've also built plugins, that can also be another source of that data. The idea with this is that we're going to be able to return that to you. If you've already requested it in a single conversation, we do have that from a conversation history. But every time that you do that new chat, you're basically looking for a new request out to there. So the orchestrator will go and actually pull the latest information from that it may have access to, either from a plugin or from Graph Connectors inside of the pre-indexed data.
Great, yeah, and I think that's a good point. Just to remind everyone is that the orchestration engine will understand, what information it needs to go and retrieve, and then do that in real time. And you as an admin do have control over what types of data with some of the things like Graph Connectors and whether or not you connect it to web data. Great. Another question from our tech community. If an external user has access to a SharePoint site or document and they are using Copilot functionality with their own tenant, would Copilot pull, extract, and use that external data, or is data retrieved exclusively from accesses internal to that organization? This is a great question. Today, the way that Copilot works is it retrieves information from your graph. And so it's not going to make cross-tenant calls to go retrieve content from another tenant. That being said, if you email content, now that becomes part of the tenant. If you were to actually share a copy of the document, then it becomes part of the tenant, but it's not making any cross organization calls for that. Okay, next question from Walter. Is there a way for end users to see their Copilot prompt history? From what I've seen, they can only delete the history, but not view it.
So you'll see the prompt history. I'll take that one. Thanks, Mary. You'll see the prompt history in an active chat. And then once you have that active chat closed out, you will no longer be able to see it.
Great. Okay, question from Tom. What constitutes usage? Clicking on Copilot button or actioning, prompting Copilot? What is an intentional action? I think, Samer, can you take this one?
You bet. Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom. So in terms of what constitutes usage, it would be, as you suggested, any intentional action with Copilot. Just to make that distinction, if you, for example, launch the Copilot pane in your Microsoft 365 app, be it Word or Outlook or what have you, that does not constitute an action. However, if you click on a button that says something to the effect of summarize my prompt or and recap this meeting, that would constitute an action. Similarly, if you engage with with Copilot by way of chat, also would constitute an action. So any end user action against the interface would be considered an intentional action.
Great. Okay. The next question we have from Brian is around Copilot for Microsoft 365 being connected to on-premise. So how is it connected to on-premise file shares and respecting user permissions? And then a follow-up question is, can Copilot be connected to on-prem Exchange server public folders? And Brian,
go ahead and take that, fellow Brian. Pleased to answer your question on there. So from a Microsoft Graph Connectors perspective, we can connect to on-premise locations. There actually are pre-built Microsoft Graph connectors that do connect to on-premise locations. And there's actually going to be an agent involved to help with kind of that handshake and ensuring that we have appropriate access into the data. So from a file share perspective, yes, that is going to be supported for there. When it comes time for permissions with Microsoft Graph Connectors, you can apply an allow or deny list. And this can be at a user, a group, or there's also a kind of custom list that you can do for that. In the case of file shares, we're basically looking at the email address, the UPN for the user, and matching that back up to what we have for Entra ID, formerly called Azure AD. So if you as a user, if you've been granted access to a location or if you've been denied to it, Copilot will also respect that from can we even show that to you inside of the results for this? So permissions are definitely flowing through from that file share perspective. In the case of the on-premise Exchange locations, do note that Microsoft Graph today does not support accessing on-premise Exchange locations. There was previous support for that at one time. It is not something that has being released into GA or general availability for that. So if you're looking for being able to access that kind of information, you would have to ingest it some fashion, either through a Microsoft Graph connector or a plugin that you may have built for Copilot to be able to reason over that kind of data. So just natively, it would not be able to touch that data out of the box.
Great, thanks, Brian. Yeah, I worked on SharePoint permissioning for many years, so it's something that I get really excited about. But I always tell people, even for other Graph, for the content that does already live in Graph, Copilot can't elevate your permissions or do anything different than to somehow get insights over data that you don't have access to. So there was a session as part of this Tech Accelerator about data governance that Jeremy and Samson did. I think it's really worth a look for everyone just to see how to properly set up your tenant, just to make sure that content is only shared with the right people, even for that data in Graph. Great. Next question. This one I think is for Alyson from LinkedIn. How should IT best think about using Copilot Lab to help users onboard to Copilot?
It's a great question. Yeah, so we're really intending Copilot Lab to be an essential learning resource that meets users at the very beginning of their Copilot journey and will continue with them as they go from a novice Copilot user all the way up through more of an advanced skill level. You'll notice we just rolled out our new web experience today. There's a number of different training of videos, learning resources, and starter prompts. And we're also going to be rolling out a share feature that will enable more community-centric learning about prompts when you're able to see prompts from coworkers on your team, learn from them and how they're prompting and unlocking the magic of Copilot. So it's a mix of both learning content on the site as well as that in-app experience where you have suggested prompts, and then hopefully as we continue on this journey, learning from others in your organization.
Yeah, great tips. And you know what, we're seeing a lot of questions on the tech community now. So thank you so much for tuning in and participating. We'll try to get to as many as we can here, and then we'll also follow up on some of them. So thank you so much. Question from Paul. In general, how is it envisioned that Copilot and Fabric would work together? If you're pulling data into your environment through Fabric, for example, you need to use graph connectors to bring in external data. Brian, I think this one might be one for you.
Sure. By Fabric, I'm not sure exactly which specific product we're referring to in here, because I do know at Microsoft we've got a lot of different areas called Fabric. If this is related to the semantic fabric, previously called the semantic index, the idea is that you can be able to have data that is going to be available to you in kind of a natural language type of processing. So if I'm referring to a specific, maybe a project name or a code name, how does that relate to other kind of areas? From a standpoint of how can we actually access the information inside of there, yes, Copilot is bringing back from not only a lexical index, but also a semantic index so that you can do keyword queries. So again, hey, I'm looking for a specific keyword match with inside of the data. But I can also ask for questions that are semantically linked to that to give me kind of the nearest neighbor kind of results for that. That data will be available for Microsoft 365 data sources. So again, inside of your chats, emails, files, and so forth. If you are talking about external data, though, yes, that would need to come in through a graph connector to be able to be reasoned over by Copilot.
Great. Okay. Is Copilot, the next question, is Copilot Dashboard and Viva Insights included in Microsoft 365 E3 license, both the current one and the upcoming dashboard? And are MyAnalytics required to be enabled?
Yep, love that question. Thanks for that, Giacomo. So the Copilot dashboard from Viva Insights comes in two flavors, as you mentioned, the current one and the upcoming one. The current one that's available in public preview today is available to all Microsoft 365 and Office 365 business enterprise customers. So that's readily available to you at aka.ms/Copilot dashboard. Now for the forthcoming one, that one will require Viva Insights license subscriptions, naturally, because much of the functionality is requiring capabilities from the Viva suite, from the Viva Insights suite. In terms of MyAnalytics required to be enabled, to tell you the truth, I'm not totally sure on that one, so I'd have to follow up with you later on.
Great, thanks. Question from Ed. Is there a limit on the size of the content included in Copilot via connector? Does this work like a RAG application for Copilot, or is the content incorporated in some way? Is there any long-term storage on the content, or is this stateless? You know, let me answer this quickly, and then Brian, I'd love to have you jump in on the connectors. I just want to remind for our audience who's listening out there, Copilot never trains on your data, whether that data is in Graph or ingested in Graph. So the way that it has access to your data to answer questions and to create a response back is through the RAG technique. Brian, is there anything you want to add specifically for Graph connectors there?
Sure. From a Graph connector standpoint, when you are ingesting items in, there is a payload limit to that. It is 4 megabytes, but do note that when we talk about that, that is in plain text. So if you do the conversions out to there, and let's just say you had a Word doc or a PDF doc, you'd actually be talking about roughly like 600 to 800 pages worth of content on there. So while you may be thinking of, hey, I've got a file and it's 4 megabytes in size, we're actually looking at the content inside of that, not all the markup, all the additional things that take up space inside of that file. So you do get quite a bit that you can ingest per item from a Graph connector standpoint.
Great. Yeah, great question, Ed. All right, our next question. Can you speak to the difference between the draft with Copilot button and the Copilot button on the ribbon? They seem to have different abilities when it comes to editing generated data. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Does one of you want to jump in on this one? Or I can talk about Word specifically. I think, yeah, I'm gonna interpret this question. So when you're in an app like Word, you have the ability to have that kind of side chat experience, and then you can also have that on Canvas experience where you can paste in and create content. There is a little bit of difference between how we've tuned the two experiences to accomplish your task. So if you're going to be, say in Word, like actually creating the document, that on Canvas experience is good. You can also highlight when you actually highlight paragraphs and you want to like rewrite. That all happens like in the Canvas. So there are some differences there. We're definitely hearing from users that some of that can be a little bit confusing. And so it's something that we're definitely investing in and making sure that wherever you're using Copilot, you have the same capabilities. Great. Okay, the next question is for Alyson, and this is our question from our LinkedIn audience. Do I need a Copilot license to access Copilot Lab?
It's a great question. Thank you. So the web experience that can be found at aka.ms/Copilot Lab, that is something that you do not need a license to view the content on. However, if you are signed in as a licensed user, it does open the door up to a number of other capabilities that are more personalized and tailored to you. So if you are on the website, as an example, you'll be able to bookmark prompts, share prompts, etc. And there'll be a footprint of all of the prompts that you've saved. Also, the in-app experience is something that can only be done through the Copilot prompt box. And so that will require a license if you want to leverage the Copilot Lab in-app experience.
Great, thank you. And there's, if you look at some of the content we have on Microsoft Mechanics, we also went into a little bit of the differences between what you get when you're signed in versus not signed in general across their different Copilot offerings. Great. Let's see. Our next question from Travis. Generally, for sensitive topics in Copilot, oh, I love this one. Can we get a list of phrases that Copilot understands are sensitive and will not give data on? This is a great question. When people talk about, when they ask about, what Copilot can do and how do you keep it safe, our responsible AI is something that we build in multiple layers of the product. I think we get this question a lot about, can you give me the list of phrases that you're checking for? The answer is no. That actually introduces an attack vector by kind of exposing that, that particular list. We do give there's a blog post that we talk about RAI and the types of not the specific phrase, but like the types of things that we're looking at. And actually RAI comes in many different forms. We have red teaming, where we're proactively identifying potential threats. We have specific RAI classifiers that run on the input and the output of Copilot to make sure that we detect certain cases. So it's something that's, if you want to learn more about RAI, there are a couple great articles available on our Copilot documentation that talk about all the different ways that we've layered that responsible RAI and some of these checks directly into the product. And of course, if you have, if you have questions, if there are ways that the product is not meeting those needs, definitely submitting feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down, really helps us understand and make sure, because this is going to be an area that we're constantly tackling and working on. Great. So this is a question for Jack from the tech community. When should I think about using a plugin? What type of data should be suited for plugins versus graph connectors?
So I think Brian gave some good context about the graph connectors being, indexed, they're ready, they're kind of, you can ask it questions about knowledge-based scenarios. So what we typically see for the plugin side, specifically with Copilot Studio, is it's either helping me get data that's kind of real time, like how can I ask a question to SAP, what is my open invoices type scenarios, but also action-based scenarios as well. So help me submit some time for vacation. So these are, I picture them more like skills that you kind of want to bring into the Copilot chat. So we're seeing them for various different scenarios, like I said, how many holidays do I have left? Who's the approver for X or Y? So really, it's kind of being much more real time and being able to then kind of take action on that line of business application as well, that maybe isn't traditionally available within Copilot for M365 graph connectors. So I always say graph connectors is your foundational grounding. And then if you want to do anything beyond that that isn't covered in that scope, we typically look for a plugin example for that. I don't know if there's anything to add, Brian, or if, yeah.
Nope, that was exactly how I would have framed it myself. So appreciate you reading my mind.
Great. Okay, the next question, more about extensibility, from Nilesh. Can we extend Copilot via Copilot Studio by direct B2B API integration for populating localized just-in-time search data repository, populated in Dataverse or any Azure database or any storage location?
Cool. I can take this. So for Copilot Studio today, when you build out plugins, what we talk about is that there's a 1,200 Power Platform data connectors that's kind of included that you can use to help design that plugin essentially. So there's various different ones like line of business applications like SAP, Workday. There are ones out of the box with Azure as an example, like Cosmos DB. But then you can also do your own custom API ones. So if we say, hey, they're not included in that box of 1,200, you can bring out your own custom API. So I think that's probably what they're saying is, can I build a plugin that queries an API and then maybe gives me the answer back to Copilot chat via the plugin? The answer is yes. We're continuing to build out the roadmap to make it a more powerful plugin that can do multi-turn and various other capabilities. Right now, it's kind of question and answer based experiences via Copilot Studio. But in summary, yes, there's much support for API coverage via a plugin.
Great. Okay, our next question from LinkedIn. Oh, this is a top question. Where is my data processed? I'll take this one. At first, I want to clarify that there's two different sets of requirements. One is for data at rest, the data that's being stored. So you can imagine that is your email on your files, and the other is around how we process your data. And so that could be how we actually protect your data in transit, but then where do we actually process the LLMs? So we have a bunch of data residency guidelines that we actually have published in terms of where your data lives. For processing, it's a different set of requirements that we do. And so first of all, I want to clarify that the large language model is all within the Microsoft 365 compliance boundary. I do think that there's a little bit of confusion that happens where you hear large language model and it feels like maybe that's some external service, but that's all it is, internal Microsoft 365 compliance boundary. And that data processed is typically if there are servers that are located in your geography, that is typically where your data gets processed. But there are some cases where that's not available for certain geographies, and so your data may be processed elsewhere. This does not change the data residency commitments that Microsoft has, and I really encourage. This is really hot topic, and we have a lot of documentation specifically on how data gets processed and where it gets processed. So I think we'll follow up with that link so that that you can read the data residency and the processing commitments. Great. Okay, a question from Paula from the tech community. Where is the data brought in with connectors actually stored when it's pulled in?
Sure, I can take this one again. So for Microsoft Graph Connectors, when we bring data in, it'll actually be ingested into the same Microsoft 365 tenant where the customer's data is already at. So sitting basically side by side with your Exchange, SharePoint, Teams, Planner, all the kind of data that you have for there. It'll be in the same sets of security, compliance, privacy types of policies that are applied to that. So that's where you can think about where that data is being stored from a Graph Connector standpoint. And then when Copilot goes to reason over it, basically going over all those sets of data, again, for Microsoft 365, as well as for Graph Connectors in that kind of side-by-side fashion.
Yeah, Graph Connectors is a hot topic today. The other thing I just add is that is one of the huge value adds for Graph Connectors is that you really, when you bring your data to Microsoft 365, you get to take advantage of the Microsoft 365 platform and all that it offers for how what you can do with that data and how it's stored. So it's great. Okay, let's see. The next question that we have from our tech community is, when Copilot Dashboard, is it available? How am I able to access Copilot Dashboard?
Yeah. I can take that. So the Copilot Dashboard that I mentioned earlier, the version that's available via the link that I mentioned earlier should be accessible to you, aka.ms/Copilot Dashboard. In terms of accessing the dashboard, you can go to the Learn documentation on it in case there's any permissions that will be required in order for you to see it at that link. So I would just advise going to learn.microsoft.com, navigating to the Copilot Dashboard for Viva Insights from Viva Insights.
Great. Thanks, Summer. And our next question, what will be the best answer for this use case? An employee uses his private computer to work from home, and he logs into Office 365 with his company account, and Office 365 Copilot is enabled. How can we make sure that Copilot will not search the files in his private computer while answering a prompt? Does anyone want to?
Yeah, no, I can jump in on that one. Yeah, so there are, if we use Word as an example, as long as that sensitivity label is filtered to personal, it should not be tracked within that. Yeah.
Great. And there are a lot of, I think the question with hybrid work has really escalated this and made it a more complex scenario. There's some best practices for how you set up, certainly like the conditional access policies for making sure that your work content isn't accessed. You can also set those policies for whether or not you have to be on a managed device. So those types of things are things that are already built into the Microsoft 365 platform that you can still leverage. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. We'll answer another question from our tech community. What is the benefit of connectors over plugins?
I bet Jack and I can probably tag team some responses on this one. I will say, to add on to the, where connector is going to show you some additional value on this, because we're basically bringing that data in to pre-index it. It is possible for Copilot to do some kind of advanced capabilities with that. So if you want to say, ask questions about content that's been brought in, it could be coming from a knowledge base article, could be coming from a page, could be coming from some kind of source like that. You can literally ask questions about the content inside of there, and Copilot will know where actually to go back and get that information from. Whereas you look at something like with a plugin, we're looking at the manifest to know, hey, the user's asking about, I want to go and do a move order. Well, I should use this application or this plugin to go and service that. So it'll be better from a kind of intent matching in from that standpoint for plugins. But I'll let Jack talk a little bit more about some of the other capabilities we get with plugins as well.
Yeah, I think you touched on it very well. I think that the last point as well we've seen is that organizations are asking, how can I build a plugin for a specific scenario where I want a little bit more control over the response? So it calls that plugin when I know it's a certain HR process, for example, rather than query the SharePoint site. Maybe there's something that it needs to be specific to that end user. And how can you build a plugin that then gives them specific advice and helps you kind of query that line of business application like Workday, as opposed to having a HR article in SharePoint, for example. So the common scenarios is I would like more control, and then Brian kind of touched on it, being able to do the real-time query to data, or even do that action piece where it's interacting with the line of business application as well.
Yeah, great. And I think we have, let's see, I think we're at time. So I thank you so much all for the questions, and any parting thoughts from any of our panelists here.
Go out there, keep exploring, find those great prompts and those productivity wins that you'll see with Copilot. So yeah, thanks so much for joining in today. Yeah.
Keep testing, keep giving us feedback. It'll only get better as we hear more from you. So thank you very much for the passion and interest.
Yeah.
I like Brian's point. Oh, sorry, Saber. I like Brian's point about experimentation. I think we're all experimenting with this new technology, and it's very exciting. So just keep experimenting, keep iterating, and we'll be learning from you as well as you learning from us, and we'll keep going together.
Great. Thank you so much, all. Thanks for the participation, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions offline as possible. Thank you.